Hey guys, so hopefully you've watched the summary, which you really need to, because it will help you understand most of the content of this video. If you've done so, then you'll understand these goals. Obviously, we're going to develop a more nuanced understanding of how Aristotle outlines his methodology in chapters 4 and 5. And we're going to do so through reading the text. Now, of course, we have three pretty familiar success criteria. The first is we will draw, Bradley, we will draw on prior knowledge gained from the summary provided before, which makes sense. That's what we're going to do. And then we're going to trace this. We're going to trace the process of how Aristotle defines the good and finds the problems with the definition. Now, look, the reason why we're tracing this time is because we're looking for nuance. We're trying to not just have the actual process, the definition given to us. What we're trying to do is look at how he arrives at that using his language, using his concepts, and getting the extra detail. Again, this idea of more nuance comes from, we're going to trace a nuanced understanding of the methodology Aristotle proposes and three relevant forms of living. So we're going to trace, I would probably say trace the development would be better, of a more nuanced understanding of the methodology Aristotle proposes and the three prevalent forms of living that we talked about in the summary. So, of course, yep. So what I'd like to do is just write down these success criteria, 1, 2, 3, and give yourself a score for each of them. And don't worry about the APK today, because I just want you to imagine Bruce Bogtrotter eating chocolate cake. So hopefully you remember Bruce Bogtrotter, and you've seen him on the Matilda movie, or you have downloaded images from Google, or you've seen him in the other mind maps that I've provided. And you've got a fair idea of this young kid just binging on chocolate cake, and you remember that has something to do with Aristotle and him looking down on the lifestyle the majority of us are supposed to have wanted to pursue, which is engaging in sensual, beastly pleasure. Alrighty, well, let's start reading. Let's start finding out what he said rather than just summarizing what he said. And we shall begin here. What is the human good? And we shall look at his little summary. It is generally agreed to be happiness, which is the general good, but there are various views of what happiness is. What is required at the start is an unreasoned conviction about the facts, such as those produced by a good upbringing. Sounds snobbish? Yeah, it does to me. But let's see what happens. Number 4. Let us resume our inquiry and state. In view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good. So every single piece of knowledge and everything we try and aim for is about us pursuing some kind of good within us. What is it that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action? Verbally, there is very general agreement, for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement will say that it is happiness. Look at that, superior refinement, say that what we try to achieve is happiness, but most of us should know right now that this happiness is meant to be eudaimonia, okay? And identify living well and faring well, or doing well, with being happy. Take a note. He's defined what happiness is by saying this is what we identify, okay? Then he goes on to say, but with regard to what happiness is, they differ. So people in general differ. And the many do not give the same account as the wise. For the former think it is some plain and obvious thing like pleasure, wealth, or honour. They differ, however, from one another. And often, even the same man identifies it with different things. With health when he is ill, with wealth when he is poor. So here we have the basic definition, which might be that it's about pleasure, wealth, or honour. But if you talk to the same man, it depends on the circumstance. So this is where we kind of got things, well, we did talk about things before, but it's more nuanced here. So, you know, happiness would be dependent on your circumstance. If a man a man wants to be healthy when he's ill, that will make him happy. A man wants to be wealthy when he is poor. Okay? So obviously you need to take a note. Then he goes on to say, but they must also be conscious of their ignorance. But conscious of their ignorance, they admire those who proclaim some great thing that is above their comprehension. So now, some thought is that apart from these many goods, there is another which is the good in itself. And this is where he's referring to a more Platonic sense of good. And the cause is the goodness of all these others as well. So obviously, good is the pure ideal form of good. It's the necessary form of good if you think about metaphysics. And it gives off its goodness to the more incomplete and more corrupt forms of goodness we were talking about up here. Take a note. I should mention that he's just saying this is what is due to popular opinion. This is not necessarily what he thinks. So you must keep that in mind, okay? To examine all of these options that have been held were perhaps somewhat fruitless, enough to examine that those that are most relevant or that seem to be arguable. So that's saying I must just argue what is the easiest to argue or the most prevalent. Take a note. Let us not fail to notice, however, that there is some significance, that there is a difference between arguments from and those to the first principles. So here he's saying something which is really important. It's about logic. There are arguments that allow us to move towards first principles, or those core pieces of logic that a rationalist would have. Or there are arguments that we can use based on first principles. Take a note. And then we talk about Plato. For Plato too was, let's move over here, was right in raising this question and asking, as he used to, are we on the way or on the way to, are we on the way from or on the way to first principles? So I think he's trying to say I might want to move to first principles. That's pretty important. There is a difference, as there is a race course between the course from the judges to the turning point and the way back. For while we must begin with what is evident, things are evident in two ways, some to us and some without qualification. I changed some to us to seem to us because I feel like things that are evident to us seem to be really important. When I say some without qualification, I still think what he's saying is things that are just necessarily logical. Like a circle can never be squared, okay? And then when we have some to us, that's things that become apparent to us or obvious to us based on our experiences. So presumably then we must begin with things evident to us. So that's where we start. Hence, anyone who is listening intelligently to lectures about what is noble and just and generally about the subjects of political science must have been brought up in good habits. So this refers to them having the good that we mentioned before, the good starting points that a young man may not have acquired yet because he lacks the experience, okay? And then we say here, for the fact is a starting point, and if we sufficiently, so means what he's saying basically, we're moving from first principles here. For the fact is a starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not have need for reason as well. And a man who has been well brought up has or can easily get starting points to move from. And as for him who neither has nor can get them, let him hear the words of Hesiod. So people who can't get these good starting points should keep these words in mind. Far best is he who knows all things himself. Good he that hearkens when men counsel right. But he who neither knows nor lays heart to another's wisdom is useless. Right. Which is basically saying here, you need to have your own insight, but you also need to be able to follow other people's wisdom. Okay? And that's where the chapter finishes. So this is all heavily related to the philosophy. I guess one thing I really like here, and we didn't really get this in the summary, is that we can almost say the starting points are uh, a, and then the kind of emergence to seeing whether or not someone is ready for engaging in political science. It means that someone needs to be well brought up and have those experiences. It didn't really come up with the concept well brought up in the summary, and we didn't really have that kind of argument. That's almost like where our first principle is that you must have good experience and you move away from that, and that is seems evident to us, or some, what does it say, the way that you can have evidence without qualification, or you can have evidence that just seems evident to us. Okay, and maybe that's the process of reasoning as who is ready for political science is the process of identifying what is evident to us. Okay, all right. Let's have Chapter 5. Discussion of the popular views of the good is pleasure, honour, and wealth. A fourth kind of life, that of contemplation, deferred to for future discussion. So we try and talk about pleasure, honour, wealth, and then we move on from there. And later on, we'll discuss the role of contemplation in pursuing the good life. Number 5. Let us, however, resume our discussion from the point at which we digressed. To judge from the lives that men... Oh, by the way, digress means to go on a tangent. If you didn't know that before, you should write that down. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem, not without some ground, to identify the good or happiness with pleasure. Write that down. And see, he's being a bit snobby, too. Okay? It's a vulgar type of pleasure. Which is the reason why they love the life of enjoyment. So enjoyment is obviously different from happiness. Okay? For there are, we may say, 3 prominent types of life. That just mentioned, so we're talking about the life of beastly pleasures, of vulgar pleasures, sensual pleasures, that is. And then he talks about the political and the contemplative life. That just mentioned the political, and thirdly, the contemplative life. Now, the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish to their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts. But they get some ground for their view from the fact that many of those in high places share the tastes of Sardin Palace. I have no idea who that is, but I'm going to probably assume he's a sensual. I assume he's a sensual hedonist. A consideration of the prominent types of life shows that people of superior refinement and active disposition identify happiness with honour, for this is, roughly speaking, the end of political life. But it seems too superficial to be what we are looking for. And that wasn't brought up in the summary. He reckons just pursuing honour is just not deep enough. It seems to be superficial. It becomes evident to us as a society that it is superficial. It is thought to depend on those who bestow honour rather than on him who receives it. But the good we divine to be something of one's own and not easily taken from one. So what he's saying is, and this wasn't brought up in the summary, so it should be note taken. The reason why it's superficial and not really that good is because it's easy to take away honour. It can be done by society. So that's not a good thing, and therefore it can't be a pure definition of the good. Take a note. Further, men seem to pursue honour in order that they may be assured of their merit. At least it is by men of practical wisdom they seek to be honoured, and among those who know them, and the ground of their virtue. Clearly then, according to them, at any rate, virtue is better. Virtue, to be good is better, but virtue is always socially defined. Remember that. And perhaps one might even suppose this to be, rather than honour, the end of political life. So he's saying even better people would pursue virtue, which is different from the summary. There's honour, but even better, there's virtue, which means having the personal qualities that are valued by others, not just having done good things. Honour would be to be seen as recognised with some merit of having done something good for society, and virtue would be to be seen as having the qualities of that type of good person. And he's saying for an even more refined type of person, you would pursue virtue. Take a note. And perhaps one might even suppose this to be, rather than honour, the end of political life, but even this appears somewhat incomplete, for possession of virtue seems actually compatible with being asleep, or with lifelong inactivity, and further, the greatest of sufferings and misfortunes. Well, you could imagine you could still have these great personal qualities, but have you performed any actions? So that kind of means that you can be virtuous but dead. Take a note. Again, that was not brought up in the summary. But a man who was living so no one would call happy unless he was maintaining a thesis at all costs. But enough of this, for the subject has been sufficiently treated even in popular discussion. Third comes the contemplative life, which we will consider later. Here he talks about the life of money making. The life of money making is undertaken under compulsion. You are compelled to do it. It's externally done. Take a note. And wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. So we know that money is not the total definition of that final good, because money is always produced to pursue another end. It is the pursuit of money is basically an instrumental pursuit, because it's basically trying to lead to another end. Take a note. Again, that wasn't brought up in the summary. And so one might rather take the aforenamed object to be ends, for they are loved for themselves, but it is evident that not even these are the end, yet many arguments have been wasted on in support of them. Let's leave this subject then. So what he's saying is a life of pursuit of beastly, ghastly, vulgar pleasure, a life of pursuing honour, which is being esteemed and celebrated by others for the actions that you have done, a life of virtue, which is cultivating the personality that other people respect, and a life of making money. All may seem like they are ends in and of themselves, but they're not. They are instrumental for trying to achieve something else, and we're just going to leave that there. All right, so I would argue that we have developed more nuanced understandings of the theory. We definitely draw it on prior knowledge. This would have been completely difficult. This has been extremely difficult for you to understand if you had not watched the summary. We did look at a more nuanced kind of process. We looked at how we defined good and saw problems with the definition. We looked at that with more detail. So we did get the nuance to do that. And we did quite easily get things from the reading that we didn't get from the summary. When we looked at the three prevalent types of life, and when we did actually look at the relationship between different types of evidence, evidence, what becomes evident to us and what becomes evident without qualification. And of course, we looked at the movement to and from first principles and how arguments can be based on either. And in many cases, it looked like, you know, when you look at political life, you take it on board as first principles that you must have a good upbringing, because they provide the starting points that you can then move away from. You get what I mean? You can move from having a good quality upbringing, good quality experiences that would then make it easy to study and understand the political sciences. All right. So if everything if everything I said made sense to you, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic. You would be around about a 4 for these. If you have problems, you need to go back to the summary, watch it, and put your hand up and ask me lots of questions. Cheers.